Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. It means everything to me. Before we get started, I just wanted to say to everybody that has been reaching out to me, showing me support, I appreciate you so much. When I tell you I appreciate you, I truly, truly mean it. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Um, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Please leave me a comment. Please leave me a like. It would mean so much to me. You guys are just the best, and I thank you, thank you, thank you. Alexander Pichushkin was a Russian serial killer who murdered 48 people. His goal was to kill at least 64 people, which would be the exact number of squares on a chessboard. Pichushkin was born on April 9th, 1974, in the Russian part of the Soviet Union. Initially, he was a sociable child, but all of that changed when he suffered a head injury. This would cause a shift in his personality, making him hostile and impulsive. Alexander would then become frequently bullied. Because of this, his mother chose to pull him from that school and put him into a special needs school. Once Alexander hit early adolescence, his grandfather would remove him from the school and take him to live with him. While living there, his grandfather would teach him how to play chess, and he would go on to play against men in Vista Park. Alexander would continue to be bullied in his gen ed classes, and things would take a turn for the worse after his grandfather passed. This would devastate him and eventually lead to a vodka addiction. He would return to his mother's home after his grandfather's death. This didn't stop Pichushkin from playing chess in Vista Park, though. It was during this time that he would develop a sadistic hobby of recording himself threatening children. Afterwards, he would watch these videos as a way to reaffirm his power, but this didn't satisfy his murderous urges. Pichushkin would commit his first murder on July 27, 1992, at just 18 years old. He had planned on killing people with his friend Mikhail, who believed it was all a joke. That is, until he realized that it wasn't. When Mikhail tried to back out of the plan, Pichushkin became so enraged that he struck his friend with a hammer and threw his body into a well. He would be questioned by police just 3 days later, but there was nothing linking him to the disappearance. In 1992, Pichushkin's girlfriend Olga had broken up with him and started dating his friend Sergei. Pichushkin became so enraged that he threw his former friend out of a window. Sergei's death would be ruled a suicide. May 17, 2001. Pichushkin was playing chess in Vista Park with a man named Yevgeny Pronin. Once that game ended, Pichushkin asked Pronin to take a walk with him to visit the grave site of his beloved dog that had passed. Pronin agreed, and the two men began walking. Once they reached an isolated spot, Pichushkin pulled out a bottle of vodka, and the two men began to have a drink in honor of his beloved Pooch. Pichushkin then bludgeoned Pronin and dumped his body in a nearby well. In 2002, the body of a woman was found with metal stakes hammered into her brain. Pichushkin would claim that the body was that of his girlfriend Olga, but this was never confirmed. February 23, 2002. A very pregnant 18-year-old girl named Maria Vircheva was crying in Vista Park after a fight with her boyfriend. Pichushkin walked over to Maria, pretending to be a kind stranger, pretending to give a shit about why she was crying, and pretending to comfort her. He was able to persuade Maria to take a walk with him and even told her his name and address. As they were walking, Maria saw an open sewage well, and the next thing she knew, she was pushed into the well. When she clung to the sides, Pichushkin grabbed her by the hair and began to smash her face against the concrete walls repeatedly before she fell 25 feet into the sewage well. She would later say that as soon as she realized her face was covered in blood and she felt the immense pain, she knew that if she didn't fall, she would die. Pichushkin left her in the well believing she was dead. By some miracle, after hours of being in that well, she was able to lift a manhole and scream for help. She was taken to the hospital and was able to give police her attacker's name and address. The cop, named Kalashnikov, was not interested in investigating the attack on her. He told Maria that he would promise to tell her boyfriend that she was safe and get him to bring her some clothes, but only if she pretended she had fallen into the well. Okay, so I already know what you're thinking. Why the hell would anyone go along with that? All right? Well, that would be because Maria was living in Moscow illegally. The policeman was later jailed for incompetence. Senior investigator Andrei Supernenko would later say that Kalashnikov's only motive for the incident was he simply didn't want to work. If the officer had done his job properly, Pichushkin would have been detained and the following would have never occurred.
Я подошла, то есть был открытый люк. У меня были распущенные волосы длинные, и начал головой бить об этот железный круг. Когда я уже поняла, что кровь заливает мое лицо, и мне очень больно, и я знаю, поняла, что если я сейчас не отпущусь, просто он меня убьет. Все, вот Господь Бог спас. Все, я отпустила руки и полетела вниз.
March 10th, 2002. Teenager Mikhail Lebov was led into Bista Park by Pichushkin with the promise of cigarettes and vodka. Once there, Mikhail was struck over the head and pushed down the well. Thinking the boy was dead, Pichushkin left. Luckily, Lebov's jacket had gotten caught on a piece of metal inside the well, saving him from plummeting into the icy waters. Mikhail was able to climb out and days later would confront Prachuskin, who threatened Mikhail with being arrested. November 15th, 2003. Neighbor Konstantin Polikonakov was invited to drink in Bista Park with Pichushkin. Once there, he bludgeoned him 3 times with a hammer before throwing him into the well, again leaving the scene assuming his victim was dead. Polikarpov successfully climbed out. He would unfortunately suffer severe head trauma and be unable to remember the incident. Police would begin to take the murders more seriously when on November 16, 2005, the body of former police officer Nikolai Zakharchenko was found. His body was left out in the open instead of being thrown into the well. It is presumed that this is because Pichushkin was becoming cocky, but not cocky enough to get caught. Just yet, that is. June 14th, 2006. Pichushkin would commit his final murder. Maria Moskaliova worked at the same store where Larissa Kulagina had worked before going missing on April 12, 2006. On June 14th, Marina took a walk in Bista Park with Pichushkin. Once there, he would strike Marina with a hammer, killing her. But what Pichushkin didn't know was that Marina had left a note for her son, letting him know where she would be and who she would be with. The note also contained Pichushkin's phone number. When the son called him, he became very suspicious of Pichushkin, so he told his dad, who phoned police to tell them what was going on. Another thing Pichushkin didn't plan for was that when Marina's body was found, it had a metro ticket. When officers pulled the CCTV from the station, they saw Pichushkin walking alongside Marina that day. He was arrested 2 days later. After his arrest, police found a logbook that Pichushkin kept. The book had 64 squares, much like a chessboard. 62 of these 64 had been filled in. That number would actually be lowered to 60 after Pichushkin found out that 2 of his victims had survived. October 2nd, 2007. Pichushkin was convicted of murder and attempted murder. During his trial, he was actually kept in a glass cage for his own protection. The judge took an hour to read the verdict and ended up sentencing Pichushkin to life in prison with the first 15 years spent in solitary confinement. In 2016, Pichushkin married a woman known only as Natalia after he proposed to her in a letter. Natalia says she sees no reason to be afraid of the 42-year-old she calls Sasha and has a tattoo of her husband and a chessboard on her arm. Natalia, who works in a children's shop, began writing to Pichushkin in 2007.
На самом деле, бисовский маньяк, как меня прозвали, это я. Совершил я, на самом деле, 61 убийство. 60 убийств все на территории Битцевского лесопарка. 1 убийство за пределами Битцевского лесопарка, в городе. Большую часть трупов я утопил в канализационном колодце. Чем убивал? Не знаю. Без этого смысла бы уже жить бы мне не было.
Richard Speck was born on December 6, 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois, to parents Benjamin Speck, who was a packer at Western Stoneware, and Mary Margaret, who was extremely religious. He was the 7th of 8 children. Richard and his sister Carolyn were much younger than the 4 other sisters and 2 other brothers. Speck's father would pass away at the age of 53 from a heart attack. Speck was just 6 at the time, and it is said that he was very close to his father. 3 years after his father's death, on May 10, 1950, Speck's mother would marry Carl August Rudolph Lindbergh, a traveling insurance salesman with a lengthy 25-year criminal record that ranged from forgery to several DUIs and was also a heavy drinker. Richard and his sister Carolyn would stay with their married sister Sarah so Speck could finish the 2nd grade before going to be with his mother and new stepfather in Texas for the start of the 3rd grade. In 1951, after being in Santo, Texas for just 1 year, Speck, his mother, stepfather, and sister Carolyn moved to East Dallas. The family would do this 9 more times over a 12-year period, usually ending up in very poor neighborhoods. Speck started drinking at age 12. In 1955, at age 13, Speck would get arrested for the first time for trespassing. By age 15, he was getting drunk every day. Dozens of arrests for misdemeanors would occur over the next 8 years. From 1960 to 1963, he worked for the 7-Up Bottling Company as a laborer. In October of 1951, Speck would meet a 15-year-old named Shirley Annette Malone at the Texas State Fair. After just 3 weeks of dating, Shirley became pregnant. The couple married on January 19, 1962, and went to live with Speck's sister Carolyn and her husband. Speck's mother was also living there, having divorced Lindbergh, who decided to move to California. July 5, 1962, Speck's daughter Robbie Lynn Speck was born. Richard would not be at the birth because he was serving a 22-day jail sentence for disturbing the peace. July 1963. At the age of 21, Speck was sentenced to 3 years in prison after being convicted of forgery and burglary after cashing a co-worker's $44 paycheck. He also robbed a grocery store for cigarettes, beer, and $3 in cash. He would be paroled in 1965 after serving 16 months at Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas. His release would be short-lived, though. Just 1 week later, on January 9, 1965, Speck would be arrested again, this time for attacking a woman in the parking lot of her apartment complex, wielding a 17-inch knife. Speck fled when the woman started screaming. Police would catch up with him very quickly, though, just a few blocks away. He was convicted of aggravated assault and sentenced to 16 months to run concurrently with his parole violation. But due to some sort of error, though, he was released just 6 months later upon the completion of his parole. July 2, 1965. After his release, he worked for 3 months as a driver for the Patterson Meat Company. And even though he had 6 accidents in the company's truck, he was fired for failing to show up to work. In December 1965, Speck went to live with a 29-year-old bartender at his favorite bar in exchange for babysitting her 3 children. In January 1966, Speck's estranged wife filed for divorce. That same month, Speck stabbed a man in a knife fight. His defense attorney would get the charges reduced to disturbing the peace. Speck was fined $10 and jailed for 3 days. March 5, 1966. Speck bought a 12-year-old car, then took it to rob a grocery store, stealing 70 cartons of cigarettes, which he sold out of the trunk of his car in the grocery store's parking lot. I can't. Police traced the car back to Speck, which he had abandoned, and on March 8th, police issued a warrant for his arrest. On March 9th, Speck's sister Carolyn took him to Dallas Bus Depot, where he boarded a bus for Chicago, Illinois. Speck stayed with his sister Martha and her family in Chicago for just a few days before deciding to return to Illinois. April 3, 1966. 65-year-old Virgil Harris returned home at 1 a.m. to find a burglar in her home brandishing a knife. The man blindfolded her, tied her up, sexually assaulted her, ransacked her house, and stole the $2.50 she had earned from babysitting that evening. A week later, the 32-year-old barmaid Mary Katherine Pierce was last seen leaving the tavern she worked for at 12:20 a.m. on April 9th. She was reported missing on April 13th, and her body was found that same day in an empty hog house behind the tavern. She had died from a blow to her abdomen that ruptured her liver. Because Speck had frequented that bar, police questioned him. On April 15th, he was told to stay in town for further questioning. On April 19th, when police came back to question Speck, they discovered that he had left. A search of his room would turn up a radio and costume jewelry that Virgil Harris had reported missing 2 months prior, along with items reported missing in 2 other local burglaries in the previous month. April 19th, 1966. Speck returned to stay at his sister Martha's second-floor apartment on North Avondale Ave. From April to June of 1966, Speck would frequently visit the National Maritime Union looking for work. 1 block east of the Maritime Union was 5 two-story townhouses, 3 of which housed senior student resident nurses and Filipino exchange student nurses. Wednesday, July 13th, 1966. Speck had spent the day drinking in nearby taverns. Later that day, he accosted 53-year-old Ella Mae Hooper at knife point. He took her to his room at the Shipyard Inn, sexually assaulted her, and stole her $16 mail order and .22 caliber rum pistol. Speck would go eat dinner and return to Shipyard's Inn Tavern for more drinks. And at about 10:20 p.m., he would leave the tavern dressed in black and armed with a switchblade in Ella Mae Hooper's handgun. He walked about 1.5 miles west on East 100th Street to the nurse's townhouse. At 11 p.m., Speck broke into the student nurse's townhouse. Using only a knife, he killed 22-year-old Gloria Jean Davy, 20-year-old Patricia Ann Matusik, 24-year-old Nina Jo Schmale, 20-year-old Pamela Lee Wilkening, 21-year-old Suzanne Bridget Farris, 20-year-old Mary Ann Jordan, 23-year-old Merlita Ornato Gargulo, 24-year-old Valentina P. Passion. Speck held the women in a room for hours, leading them out one by one in 20 to 30-minute intervals, where he would either stab or strangle each one. One woman, Corazon Amaro, was able to escape by crawling under a bed when Speck was out of the room. She would stay under that bed until 6 o'clock in the morning. It is believed that Speck either lost count or forgot about her. Fingerprints found at the scene were matched to Speck. 2 days after the murders, Speck was identified by a drifter named Claude Lunsford. Speck, Lunsford, and another man were drinking at the Star Hotel at 617 West Madison. Lunsford recognized him from the sketch and phoned police. The police did not show up to the call, even though there are records that the call was indeed made. It wasn't until 12:30 a.m. when the Star Hotel staff called police after Speck attempted suicide by jumping off the balcony, and he was taken to Cook County Hospital. Once at the hospital, 25-year-old surgical resident physician Dr. Leroy Smith recognized Speck and phoned police, and he was arrested. Speck later claimed that he had no recollection of the murders, even though he gave a full confession to Dr. Smith while at the Cook County Hospital. Illinois Supreme Court Justice John J. Stamos, who was the state's attorney during the trial, knew about the confession, but said, "We don't need it. We have an eyewitness." That eyewitness would be Corazon. Speck's trial began on April 3rd, 1967 in Peoria, Illinois, 3 hours southwest of Chicago, with a gag order put on the press. In court, Speck was positively identified by the sole surviving student nurse, Corazon. When she was asked if she could identify the killer of her fellow students, she got up from her seat in the witness box, walked directly in front of Speck, pointed her finger at him, nearly touching him, and said, "This is the man." Lieutenant Emil Geis testified in regards to the fingerprints being a match. On April 15th, after 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Speck guilty and recommended death. On June 5th, 1968, Judge Herbert Pashkin sentenced Speck to die in the electric chair. That should be it, right? End of story? Nope, not quite yet, my friends. June 28th, 1971, U.S. Supreme Court upheld Speck's conviction, but reversed the death sentence because more than 250 potential jurors were unconstitutionally excluded from the jury because of their conscientious or religious beliefs against capital punishment. November 21st, 1972, Judge Richard Fitzgerald resentenced Speck from 400 to 1,200 years in prison. 8 consecutive life sentences of 50 to 150 years. He was denied parole in 7 minutes at his first hearing on September 15th, 1976, and at 6 subsequent hearings in 1977, 1978, 1981, 1984, 1987, and 1990. While incarcerated at Stateville Correctional Center, he was given the nickname Birdman because he kept a pair of sparrows that flew into his cell. He was described as a loner who kept a stamp collection and enjoyed listening to music. He was hardly a model prisoner, though, often getting caught with drugs or distilled moonshine. Punishments for this never seemed to bother Speck, with him saying simply, "I'm here for 1,200 years." Speck loathed reporters and only allowed one interview in 1978 to Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene. During the interview, he publicly confessed to the murders for the first time and said he thought he would get out of jail sometime between now and the year 2000. Okay, buddy. Once out, his plan was to run his own grocery store business. He would go on to say that at the time of the killings he had no feelings, but that he had changed, saying, quote, "I had no feelings at all that night. They said there was blood all over the place. I can't remember. I'm sorry as hell for those girls and for their families and for me. If I had to do it all over again, it would be a simple house burglary," end quote. Speck's final thought for the American people was, quote, "Just tell them to keep up their hatred for me. I know it keeps up their morale, and I don't know what I'd do without it," end quote. In May of 1996, Bill Curtis from Chicago Television News received videotapes made at the Stateville Correctional Center in 1988 from an anonymous attorney. Publicly showing them for the first time before the Illinois state legislature, Curtis pointed out the explicit scenes, sex, paraphernalia, and money being passed around by prisoners who had no fear of being caught. In the center was Speck performing oral on another inmate, parading in silk panties, sporting female-like breasts, allegedly grown using smuggled hormone treatments, and saying, quote, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose," end quote. From behind the camera, a prisoner asked if he killed those nurses. Speck responded, "Sure I did." When asked why, Speck shrugged and said jokingly, "It just wasn't their night." When asked how he felt about himself in the years since, he replied, "Like I always felt, had no feeling. If you're asking me if I felt sorry, no." He went on to describe in detail what it feels like to strangle someone, saying, "It's not like TV. It takes over 3 minutes and you have to have a lot of strength." December 4th, 1991. Speck was transferred to the hospital after complaining of severe chest pains. He would later die in the early morning hours of December 5th from what is believed to be a heart attack, 1 day shy of what would have been his 50th birthday. The coroner would state that Speck had an enlarged heart, emphysema, and clogged arteries, which most likely contributed to a fatal heart attack. Because Speck's sister feared that his grave would be desecrated, he does not have an actual physical resting place. After his death, Speck was cremated and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location.
July 1966, Corazon Amareo shouts from a balcony the blood-curdling cry heard across America. "They are all dead. God, I'm the only one alive." And the 23-year-old Filipino exchange student was the only survivor of Richard Speck, the only survivor of a crime that altered our definition of crime. Amareo was one of 9 student nurses at the South Chicago Community Hospital living in this townhouse on East 100th Street, all of them herded at gunpoint by the journeyman criminal into one bedroom and then systematically murdered. 25 years later, she is the picture of a mature woman that they all might have been. Now, Cora Atienza, married 23 years and living here in Northern Virginia. Her son is in business school, her daughter studying nursing. You never did interviews over the 25 years?
Never. This is my first time to come out, yeah.
Why? Why did you decide now?
Well, because I said he's dead already. He will not be able to get out. You know, he will not be able to come looking for me anymore.
When Speck knocked on her bedroom door here that terrible night a quarter-century ago, Cora Amareo thought he wanted money, and now says even when she was hiding under the bed, she didn't know her friends were being killed.
Well, I was just praying, Our Father, Hail Mary, you know. After he was taking these girls one by one outside that big bedroom, that's when I realized that he was doing something to them, but I never think that he was killing them.
She had only been in the U.S. 3 months, but the terror of those 3 hours will haunt her forever.
But I was just so scared, you know. It's very, very scared.
Is it even tough for you to say the name Richard Speck even now, after you've testified against him 25 years later?
Yeah, once in a while I can say Speck, that's it. I can't believe that they were dead and I'm not, and I'm still alive. God have some, you know, he I think she spared me so that I can do more things, you know. Like
She's raised a family, gives to her church and community, is still an
like,
intensive care nurse in Washington. She survived Richard Speck and now outlives him, but says Speck has taken part of her to his grave and beyond.
Because after that night, I'm always scared, you know. I'm not that kind of person because I'm always a happy person. But then after that night, seems like he takes some of my, you know, like happiness.
Is Richard Speck in hell?
Well, I guess he is. I hope he is there.
In Woodbridge, Virginia, Chuck Gowdy, Channel 7 Eyewitness News.